In this video, I want to go through every single supply and tool that I use to wire up the BMW. In my opinion, having the right supplies and tools has a huge impact on the quality of the finished wiring harness, but also on how enjoyable the whole wiring process is. And since it can be quite hard to find all of the different things, I thought it might be a good idea to go through everything to hopefully make it a little bit easier for you. The first thing, and I would say one of the most important things to have, is a wiring diagram. And if you can sit down and take the time to actually draw up your own, that will help you so much to actually understand the basics of wiring. If you want to know my process of how I did this from scratch without any knowledge, then check out the next two videos that I'm going to put out, because those will explain all of the different processes and how you can calculate the right wire sizes and stuff like that. Speaking of wire sizes, this is probably the most obvious thing that you need to wire up your bike, but there are quite a lot of differences in the quality of wires that you can get. The ones that I bought are called FLRY, and they are temperature rated up to 105 degrees Celsius. And I got wires from 0.25 all the way up to 6 square millimeters, all based on the wiring diagram that I drew up. There you just have to see what works for your setup. Now, those are all of the wires that I use to wire up all of the parts apart from the battery. And keep in mind that those are the ones that have multiple little copper strands in them and not the ones with one solid copper core. But for the battery, you have to use bigger wires, 6 AWG, which is equivalent to 16 square millimeters cross section. And I first bought these ones, which are dedicated battery cables, but look at how stiff they are. Since these were so hard to route, I did some research and found that a few people actually use welding wire for their battery leads. This is called H01N2D, and it's super easy to work with because it has 1 million copper strands in there. 1 million is an exaggeration, but you get the point, and that makes it so flexible. So that is what I use, and I only got it in black, which is actually quite nice because it gives a sleek look, but I used red heat shrink to actually color code the positive lead. Now, talking about heat shrink is also something very important, and here you can use the very generic stuff. I had 2 different sets that I think I got off eBay or Amazon. The first one has a shrink ratio of 2:1 and no glue on the inside, and I used that for covering up like the ends of ring terminals and things like that. But when you use the sleeving, which I'm going to get to in a second, then it's good if you have heat shrink that has a shrink ratio of 3:1 and glue on the inside, because the glue makes it stick to the wires and to the sleeve, and then you can't really pull that apart. Before I used this, I used the one without glue on the sleeves as well, and that wouldn't really hold. So I switched to that one, and that works perfect on these TechFlex sleeves because they give your whole wiring harness such a sleek appearance. I got 3 different sizes from this specific type of sleeve. It's called tight weave, and I would actually suggest to drop the biggest size that I got, which was 12.4 millimeters. That is way too big, and take the 3 smallest sizes. So the first one is 3.2 millimeters, the next one is 6.4 millimeters, and then the biggest one is 7.9 millimeters. You can probably also get away with the 2 smallest sizes, but I don't know, if you want to be on the safe side, and it really depends on how large the wires are that you choose, you might want to get the 3rd version as well. It's not cheap, but it's also not expensive, and you get like a super big roll. You can probably wire up like 5 bikes or 6 bikes with this, and it makes it look so nice. Now, one tip for a very clean looking wiring harness is to have kind of like a standard procedure where, you know, if I have a ring terminal, I'm going to use 1.5 centimeters of heat shrink. If I have a small sleeve, I'm going to use 2.5 centimeters of heat shrink or something like that, and always have the same measurements of the heat shrink and stuff like that. That will make your wiring harness look very clean in the end. So now that we have the wires covered, we can move over to the wire ends, and here I started to kind of like accumulate a big selection of all the possible terminals that I might need. I just wanted to have everything to be able to just work and go through the whole process without having to wait until something arrived. So let's start with the first one, which is ring terminals. So I got a generic set of ring terminals that you can crimp onto wires from Amazon or eBay. These are for M3, M4, M5, M6, M8, and M10. From my experience, I would say these ring terminals work well for wire sizes up to 1.5 square millimeters. You can squeeze a 2.5 square millimeter wire in there, but it's not ideal. For that, there are special ring terminals. They also have the same kind of like crimping mechanism, but they are designed for bigger wires. They have a slightly bigger opening. For these standard crimp terminals, like the ring terminals or the Spade terminals that we get to in just a second, you can get one of the very, very basic crimp pliers. It doesn't matter how fancy it is. These are like, I don't know, $15 off Amazon, and they normally work for 0.5, 1 and 1.5 square millimeters. If you can find a set that has a bunch of different jaws basically, that might actually make sense to get that. But you have to make sure that the jaws are not all for these like pre-insulated crimp connectors. They have to be for the uninsulated crimp connectors like this one, because otherwise you can't really use them. But I now have 1, 2, 3 of these crimp pliers just because I needed different jaws. And if you can get a set that has all of them in kind of like one package, then that's actually a good buy. So moving on to the bigger wires, for the 6 square millimeter wire and the battery wires, you need to use battery lugs, and they look like this. They basically have a round opening at the top, and then you can get different sized holes for M5, M6, M4, whatever you need. Some people solder those onto the wires, but from what I've heard, that can create a weak point, so I always opted to crimp those. For the 6 square millimeter lugs, you can use a simple pair of crimping pliers that looks like this. And if you crimp on 2 sides, so you crimp first and then flip it around and crimp again, then that's actually a solid crimp. So that is an inexpensive way and secure way to get these on your wires. And you can get those lugs in straight and with a 90-degree bend. So depending on your application, you just choose the one that works for that setup. For the bigger wires, it's the same thing. You can choose 16 square millimeters, and then you have different openings for different size screws wherever you need to connect it to. And again, also in straight and with a 90-degree bend. But for those, you need a special pair of crimping pliers. And also, not super expensive, you can get a set that comes with a cable cutter for battery wires and a big pair of crimping pliers that looks like this, and that can crimp these 16 square millimeter lugs super easily. So with those tools, you can actually make your own battery wires for relatively cheap. Now the next type of very classical connector is the Spade terminal, and you can again use the very basic crimping pliers for that. Here you have 3 different sizes and always a male and a female, depending on either the terminal on your motorcycle, or you can also use them in like plastic housings as a proper plug. These again work well with wires up to 1.5 square millimeters. You can squeeze a 2.5 square millimeter in there. I did that. But if you have bigger wires that you need to crimp those onto, then you can actually find bigger openings, but for those you also need a different type of crimp pliers, which I don't have. I just use those for the 2.5 square millimeters that go to the starter solenoid. On the starter solenoid, I just had 1 Spade terminal, but I needed to connect 2 wires. So I got these little adapter pieces where you make 2 Spade terminals out of 1. That worked very well. And then you can also get those with a 90-degree bend in all the 3 different sizes. To crimp the 90-degree connectors, you actually need to get a separate pair of crimping pliers. You can just buy the jaws if they fit into one of your other crimp pliers. I got the jaws for like $23 or something like that, and if I had to buy the whole pliers, then it would be like $90, so a huge price difference. And then the last thing about these connectors is that if you buy a set, which is totally fine, you normally get a transparent cover for both sides. But if you want to have it look sleek on your bike and just have black kind of like wire ends, then you can actually buy black silicone covers individually for all of the different sizes. So that's what I did to make that all look uniform. The last crimp connectors that I use that aren't specifically for plugs are these ones, and they are to join wires or splice into wires. You can also solder that, but I wanted to solder as little as possible because I feel like with a crimp connector, you get a much more reliable and similar result every time you use them. And here I have 2 different types, these tubular ones right here, and then the U-shaped connectors. I tried to use the tubular ones as much as possible just because I feel like it gave me a much more solid connection because they are a lot longer than the U-shaped ones. So you have a lot more contact area where you can actually grip the wire. So I try to use those as often as possible, but with those you can't really connect all of the super small wires like the ones that come from the speedometer. For those I use these U-shaped crimp connectors, and they basically have like a mirrored crimp end from the ring terminals or the Spade terminals, and you have to crimp those quite a few times, but you have to see what works for your pliers and your connectors and your wire sizes. And then I also use these relatively small U-type crimp connectors to have a wire basically change direction within the loom. So I had a wire that would come back, but I actually wanted it to go that way into a plug. So I basically just crimped the two ends in here, put some heat shrink over there, and then squeezed the heat shrink tight with pliers so that it's actually sealed. That way you have a wire that changes direction in the wiring loom, so you can kind of hide it. And yeah, the last thing in this box are the fuses. For the M unit setup, you only need one fuse, so you can get away with a single fuse bracket, and I found two valid options. This one has the traditional car style fuse that you push in from the top, and it has two 6 square millimeter wires already attached to it. So this is perfect for the M unit setup. But I also find a second one that has this style of fuse and is a little bit bigger, but you can attach your own wires, so you don't have to extend these. If you need more fuses, then you need to do some research on a special fuse box for that. Now we can move on to some of the more special parts that I use on the BMW, and that are all of the plugs. Let's start with this set right here. I did get two sets of Deutsch pin connectors from JR Ready. This one is the DT series, and that comes with the crimp pliers, because you need special crimp pliers for these solid crimp connectors that they come with. And you can get cheaper versions of Deutsch pin connectors that have open crimp terminals, but I would always opt for the higher end version, because this is just so satisfying to work with. Having the right crimp pliers also makes a huge difference, because you can actually adjust the pliers to the wire size that you use. Also with this screw that screws in here in the back, you can adjust the pliers for the crimp connectors for the DT series or for the DTM series. They are slightly different in size. So that is very, very nice that you get this high quality tool with this kit. And then you also get the depinning tool, which is also super important to have for these plugs, because you need to get these wedges out whenever you want to disassemble a plug. And with this tool, it is as easy to disassemble the plugs as it is to assemble them. So that is a huge recommendation for Deutsch pin connectors if you want to go the high quality route. And these ones, the DT series, are rated for 13 amps on each of the individual connectors. And then if you have a smaller connection where you don't need that much, you can use the DTM series, which you can also get in a set, and those are rated for up to 7 amps on each crimp connector. And I also use those on the wire ends that go into the M unit terminals, and I think that gives it a super clean look. So yeah, these are super fun to work with. If you want to check out those two sets, I'm going to link them down below for you. Unfortunately, I can't link you everything, because I bought a few things 3 years ago with like the first parts for the BMW, and a few of the links got lost, but I'm sure you can find them. The last thing that I want to show you when it comes to plugs are these super amazing plugs. They are called Mizu-P25 from a company called Molex, and they are the smallest plugs probably that you can find, that are water sealed and can carry up to 7.5 amps on each crimp connector. The only problem that I had with those is that Molex has a few different types of plugs in the P25 series, and the crimp connectors are so similar that I didn't notice that there was actually a difference. So I bought 200 of the wrong crimp connectors, and you can't really tell unless you look super closely on the picture or in real life. One of them has a little gap in the top and the other one is closed, and the closed one is the wrong one. You need to get the one that is slightly opened, and then they work great. They aren't as easy to disassemble as the Deutsch pin connectors, but that's just because they are so tiny. So for those, I would highly recommend to get the proper depinning tool. They want 30 bucks for a tiny thing like this, but if you make a little mistake, then you want to be able to actually like remove the wires, or if you need to repair something. So I would suggest you get this, and then those are amazing. The only downside with those is that the professional crimp pliers are like 450 bucks or so, which is ridiculous. Obviously, professional tools have professional prices probably, but I found, fortunately, that one of my very generic crimp pliers that I got years ago, I don't even know why, that works. That has smaller openings than the other generic crimp pliers that I have. So this is probably for like 0.25, 0.5, 0.75 and 1 maybe. I'm not really sure, it doesn't say anything on here, but that should be the case. The 0.5 square millimeter opening actually works well for the Mizu crimp connectors. So fortunately I found something, but I would say it's definitely a lot cheaper to buy 2 of the generic crimp pliers and try to find one with a small jaw opening that also works for those than to get the $450 professional crimp plier tool. Now the last few things that you need to wire up your bike are, on the one hand, wire cutters, then wire strippers. There are a few different styles of wire strippers, but I would always go for an automatic one that you can actually adjust to the wire size. This one is from Knipex and it works from 0.2 to 6 square millimeter wire. Right here at the top you can adjust the wire size, and then below you can adjust how much of the wire you actually want to strip, and those work great. They are not super expensive, so that is definitely a worthwhile investment. And then just a simple pair of scissors to cut all of the heat shrink. And then for the heat shrink, you also have to have a heat gun. For the heat gun, you can find different attachments that fit right here on the front. And what I found works best is the curved one. This one wasn't always curved. In my set, I only had a straight one, but I curved this up so the heat gets reflected also to the backside of whatever you try to heat up. And that works super, super well. So you don't always have to turn the wire in front of the heat gun. And it also protects everything that is behind what you try to heat up. So that is very nice. And one last thing with the heat gun, don't overdo it. I have mine set to level 4 out of 9. On my first connection, I actually burned away all of the sleeving because I had this all the way up to 9 and gave it full power. Now for wire management, it makes sense to get a generic set of cable ties. And if you want to have some that you don't always need to cut while planning them, you can actually get Velcro cable ties. I had a few that I used on the BMW, they come in quite handy. And the last thing that I would say is also very important is a multimeter. And when it comes to multimeters, there are huge price differences. You don't need to go overboard. We just need a very few basic functions. This one was like 30 bucks. It's from a company called Voltcraft. And the name of this specific model is VC1301. And the only 2 settings that I actually use were the setting to read the voltage of the battery and the continuity setting. The continuity setting will be your best friend when it comes to wiring, so definitely familiarize yourself with that. It's relatively simple. You turn this on, you have the right probe plugged into the terminal that has the same symbol like the continuity setting right here, and then whenever you touch these 2 and you have a good connection, it just beeps. So with that setting, you can check a lot of things that you will need to check. And that is basically all that I use it for, but it came in very handy. Oh, and actually one more thing that can come in very, very handy is a soldering station. This one is called Icon Pico. It's not super cheap, but I heard that it is relatively high quality. It works great, and I use that to connect some of the wires, but then I switch over to the crimp connectors. So for that, you don't necessarily need it, depending on which way you want to go. But I also use that to tin the wires that sit inside the switches to protect them so the screws wouldn't cut the wire ends. So having a soldering station is definitely not a bad thing to have. And if you want to solder, you also need some flux and some solder wire. This is lead-free SNCU04, and that worked great to solder all of the wires. I hope that this overview helps you to find the right supplies for your wiring harness. If you have any questions, leave them down below in the comments. And if you want to see how I used all of this to wire up the BMW, then check out this video right here. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.